This is Joyce Latimer at Virginia Tech, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about some of the early growth regulation that we can get with liner soaks and liner drenches. And I want to acknowledge Margaret Aiken, who runs our greenhouse and a lot of our research projects. So when we talk about using liner soaks, we're talking about how to control the growth of vigorous crops. These are applications where we want early and rapid growth control of growth. And we have some issues with sprays in this application. Usually if we wait until after those transplants are established, we'll find that they're overgrown or stretched. You can see those very long internodes there. And those are not, that's not a good start to the crop we want to grow. There's also issues with application uniformity with sprays. And I know growers are getting much better at this, but I still see this kind of an example fairly often. Someone showing me two plants, and I think one's a control and one's a treated, and they'll say, oh no, they were both in the same treatment. So the spray uniformity, if that is poor, if spray uniformity is poor, you're going to have very poor crop uniformity. So you need to concentrate on uniformity of application. So we're talking about liner soaks as a way of making that a little bit easier. The other issue we have with sprays, and this really is true of all methods of application of any chemical, but environmental conditions of the plants do affect the PGR uptake or any other chemical uptake. But we have a little more issue with spray applications. They're just a little more affected by drying conditions and the status of the plant at the time of application. I want to stress, you should never apply plant growth regulators to a stressed plant. So never. That will reduce your efficacy and it will also increase your phytotoxicity. So, but liner soaks may give us a little more flexibility with some of these environmental conditions because we're not concentrating on drying time. Yes, you know, transpiration and how actively the plant is growing and transpiring can all affect it and are affected by the environmental conditions, but it's just not as significant in the long run as the drying time that we have with sprays. So we're going to talk about liner soaks or liner drenches. Of course, we're only talking about using soil-active plant growth regulators for this kind of treatment. And we're talking about early application. We're talking about making these usually just prior to transplanting, the day before usually. And we're doing the root applications are less impacted by the environmental conditions, which gives us the opportunity for a more uniform crop. Now, our goal with a liner soak or liner drench is to provide baseline control, early control of that vigorous crop. We can always come back and make additional treatments later if necessary. So it's better to err on the side of softer rather than harder, because this can be a very persistent treatment as well. So a liner soak is actually soaking the root ball in the PGR solution. The timing on this is not critical. Typically we're seeing 30 seconds to 2 minutes. The most important thing is to establish a protocol and be consistent in that protocol. You do want to make sure that those plugs are what we call dry, which doesn't mean they're wilted. Again, no stress plants. We want them ready for irrigation. So they're dry enough that they will take up the solution, but not under any stress conditions. One of the advantages of this is being able to treat the plants early enough that they can just sit on the bench during the REI, treat them one day, come back the next day and put them on the transplant line. So you don't have to worry about any special protective gear when the plants are being handled. You can do this manually, as you see here in this picture, simply dipping them in a tray or vat, or you can run them through some type of a trough that has the PGR solution in it. 30 seconds is really quick. You just want to saturate that root ball and they can move right on out. Now the other side of this is the liner drenches. Again, soil-active plant growth regulators. We're drenching the liner with the PGR solution prior to transplant. Again, preferably the day before so you eliminate any REI issues. Also using dry plugs. You can do this manually. This is a specific amount, a specific volume of water. Or you can run them through use an irrigation boom or run them through a water tunnel to actually apply the drench treatment. We're going to talk about volume a little bit later. That is an issue that you want to think about when you're making these applications. So I wanted to start just by showing you a comparison of plant response to a spray application versus the liner soak. These Rudbeckia were all from the same plug flats and started on the same day, transplanted on the same day. The liner soak was done the day before transplant, the evening before transplant. The spray application was made 2 weeks after transplanting, after the plants were fully established. So you can see the controls, you can see they're comparable in terms of size, and the time here, the 4 weeks after and the 6 weeks after, is the time after the actual treatment with the PGR. So our liner soaks, you can see even 1 part per million gave us the comparable control to 45 or a little better parts per million of a spray application. We've got earlier control, which means we have more control. We've got root uptake, which also gives us more activity. And so we get a lot more control with a liner soak. So when you start looking at rates, and we'll show you some examples here, but when you start looking at rates, you want to think really low, especially when you look at Concise or fluoroperenadol. You want to look at very low rates. So just an example here, again, a lot of activity, some delay in flowering. 1 part per million is really a little bit too high for Rudbeckia Goldsturm with a Concise liner soak. Now what I'm going to do now is show you a series of crops that we worked with on liner soaks using Piccolo 10XC. Piccolo 10XC is not currently labeled for liner soaks. So this was some work we did to help with the label recommendation to add liner soaks to that label. So this is GARA, and again we used Piccolo 10XC, rates of 1, 2, 4, and 8 parts per million. Do notice the rates because they change with the different crops that I'm going to show you. And remember that our goal is to provide baseline control. Early control, you make more treatments later. You can see the amount of control we got immediately. This is at 2 weeks after treatment. And I should say again, just to clarify, all of our liner soaks were done the day before they were potted up. So 2 weeks after treatment is 2 weeks after planting. So let's look at those same plants at 4 and 6 weeks after treatment. And you can see that we still have a lot of good growth control, especially at 4 weeks after treatment. And one of the things that you want to think about when you're choosing these rates is, first of all, how you grow. That's still going to be a really big issue, just as choosing all of your plant growth regulator rates. Depends on how you grow, how vigorously the plants grow in your conditions, and also how the plant itself grows. This gets back to the art of plant growth regulation. You need to know how the plant grows. You need to know when its bursts of growth are, and how you're going to counteract that, or how much control you need, or how long you need that control to last. All of those things will affect what kind of rate you choose. For example, if you were ahead of your window, your market window, and you knew you needed to hold these plants a little longer than you had planned to, you might want to go with a higher rate with a 2 part per million, so they still looked good at 6 weeks when they went out the door. You can play with that as long as you plan ahead. We're talking about planning 6 weeks ahead. It's not something you can do last minute. On the other side of that coin, you can do the 1 part per million and come back with a spray if you need to hold them. That's the flexibility that we need with this kind of a treatment. Use it as a baseline, come back later if you need to. But again, look at these rates. 1 to 2 parts per million gave us good control of the GARA pink fountain. So let's look at Coreopsis. This Coreopsis Sweet Dreams. Notice that we're up to 8 parts per million at 4 weeks after. We basically have no control. We have a little bit at 2 weeks after treatment, but we have no control. So our baseline was really, really short. Do notice, though, that we have a more upright appearance with the treated plants. So we got a good start. We kept it from falling apart, from getting a little bit too bushy, too long internode, and falling apart early in crop production. So we got a significant improvement in the appearance of the crop. This is a Penstemon Laura, and again, we had some control at 2 weeks. Really, once we got into 4 weeks, just a little bit, still at 16 parts per million. After 4 weeks, there was no control at all. Again, look at the rate, up to 16 parts per million for Penstemon. We're talking about 1 to 2 for GARA. You have to look at these individually, and you're going to need to do your own testing. And this is Monarda, as you can imagine. It's another one that's going to need a higher rate. 16 parts per million gave us a little bit of control, still lasting at 4 weeks after treatment, but not much. So you're going to have to go higher, or again, come back with those later applications and sprays or drenches. Veronica was also very responsive to the low rates of our liner soaks with Piccolo 10XC. And again, that held very nicely all the way through 8 weeks after treatment. So just a summary of these crops on the Piccolo 10XC liner soaks. A wide variety of the herbaceous perennials are going to be responsive to the liner soaks. It's an excellent way to get the product into the plant at very low concentrations and in a very large-scale, efficacious manner. But the concentrations are going to change a lot depending on the crop. You see with our Coreopsis, we were talking about rates around 10 to 12 parts per million. These are suggested. These are higher than what we actually used in this study. The Gara, 2 to 4, depending on how long you want to hold it. Monarda, we're talking about 16 or over 16 if you want to go longer than 4 weeks after treatment. Penstemon and Laura, very vigorous, 16 parts per million, did not hold it back. And our Veronica Pink Panther was very nicely controlled with 2 to 4 parts per million. Also wanted to give you a little information on Piccolo liner soaks for annuals. So I asked Roberto Lopez if I could use this table that he had published while he was still at Michigan State on some of the liner soaks they had done with some of the vegetative annuals. And you can see that the rates also vary significantly with different cultivars, with different crops. And I wanted to point out cultivar. In this study, the Blackie sweet potato vine was very sensitive to the liner soaks. 1 to 3 parts per million was a recommended rate. However, in a later study, they used Marguerite, and Marguerite was not responsive at up to 16 parts per million. So again, there are going to be cultivar differences. You're going to have to do your own trials to get that worked out. So just a summary, keys to using Piccolo 10XC as a liner soak. It is a cost savings application if you can automate it. Remember that Paclobutrazol is labeled for chemigation. You can use it in an irrigation system, which does make it much easier to automate. Start with lower soak rates for crops that you know are responsive to spray applications of Paclobutrazol. That would be my recommendation as far as testing your own crops. Start low with ones you know are quite responsive to a spray application and go higher for those that you know are responsive. And somewhere in between if you don't have a clue. In many cases, these liner soaks are going to allow us to make the applications in the greenhouse, and especially for our perennials, this is very nice. We will not have to make applications once they go into the field. So we can get all of those done in the greenhouse, maybe even on their way out the door. So the liner soaks are currently labeled on the 0.4% Paclobutrazol, basically just for Piccolo and Paxol. It is not on the bonsai label at this time. As I said, we did this work in order to get a liner soak label for Piccolo 10XC, and that is in the works. They're hoping to have that request submitted later this spring, so that should be coming out hopefully this year. We'll let you know as soon as that's out. And again, species and cultivars are going to vary in the response, so you're going to have to conduct your own trials. All right, let's talk about Uniconazole. We started working with some of the grasses, ornamental grasses, we found to be very difficult to control with spray applications of Sumagic or Concise Uniconazole. We have basically no significant effect. You see a little bit of control there with 60 parts per million. However, when we started looking at liner soaks, we found that these grasses and some of the other crops that we considered hard to control were very responsive to the liner soaks. So these were grasses that were donated to us from a propagator. And he was basically having to prune these plants all summer long to keep them under control until he was ready to use them. So we found that single application of a liner soak at probably 2 to 3 parts per million would give him up to 12 weeks of reduced pruning, give him up to 12 weeks of control. We found that that was the same effect we had with miscanthus. Good control all the way through 12 weeks after the liner soak. So again, for hard to control crops, ones that are not responsive to spray applications, this is a good method to try, simply because you're able to get more of that product directly into the plant. So keys to using Concise. Again, it can be a cost-saving application if you can automate it. Uniconazole is not labeled for chemigation. It's not a legal use to put it in an irrigation system. There are drenching systems that are made for products like this, where it dilutes it and makes the drench. You can do that, but it is not. You cannot put it in a general irrigation system. If you're going to try the liner soaks, I would start with very low rates, maybe in that 0.5 to 1 part per million. And again, this would help a lot in terms of being able to make these applications of PGRs in the greenhouse or in the propagation area before these plants move out into the field. Again, Fine Americas is requesting a label amendment for Concise to add liner soaks to that label. It is not currently there, but that probably will not be submitted until later in this year, maybe in the summer. So don't look for that for this season. Again, you're going to have to test different rates on your cultivars because they're all going to respond a little differently. Michigan State has done the research on the vegetative annuals, and they suggest that a 1 to 4 part per million liner soak will give you 6 to 8 weeks of control of growth of those crops. So that, again, is a good starting point for your own trials. We've done a little bit with Collate as liner soaks as well, and we're not seeing on this crop, on Veronica First Love, we did not see any effect on growth regulation or branching at 2 weeks after treatment. However, when we potted those plants up and measured them at 8 weeks after treatment, we had no growth regulation, but we did have an increase in the number of leaders and branches. Again, a label amendment is in process for Collate, for adding the drench to Collate, probably not the liner soak at this time. The keys to using Collate in the greenhouse, again, Collate is just Ethifon is a very cost-effective product to use in the greenhouse. The liner soak or drench applications would increase the options for using it in the greenhouse, but it is not currently labeled for that. Even with using a soak or a drench, you must make sure that that final solution pH is between 4 and 5. Try not to get too much lower than 4, but make sure it's below 5. And it's, with any use of Ethifon, you need to think about flower delay and the impact that application is going to have on flowering. So let's talk just a minute about liner soaks versus liner drenches. Most of what I've shown you have been liner soaks, but we have done some preliminary work, and this is preliminary, comparing liner soaks and liner drenches. And if you look at this top row, this is Agastaki using the first plant, of course, is our untreated control. The second one is a 1 part per million liner soak of Uniconazole, Concise, the day before planting. We also did a 1 part per million liner drench. These were in 72 size cells. We did 10 milliliter drench of 1 part per million. We also did a drench the same day the plants were potted. So 1 ppm AT drench is 1 part per million after transplant, drenched to the entire pot. So that was 10 fluid ounces to a tray gallon pot. Our last treatment there, 30 ppm AT spray, is in a spray application, again, the same day the plants were planted. So effectively, within 12 hours or so, all of these plants were treated at the same time. You can see at 4 weeks after treatment. Now, this was late in the season. We didn't have as good a growth as as you would in the spring. But you can see that even at 4 weeks after treatment, we have some significant differences in the response to the plants. Looking at 8 weeks after, you can see that we got good growth control with both the liner soak and the liner drench, excessive control with our drench of the entire pot, the after transplant drench, and really a crappy looking plant with spray. But I do want to go back and say with some of the, we've done this with several crops, but again, I consider it very preliminary. We're seeing a little bit more response to the liner drench than we're seeing to the liner soak. So I think that comes back to the volume that we're applying in that drench. So you're going to have to establish a consistent volume of application. And with your whatever method you're going to use to make a liner drench, you're going to have to establish a consistent volume and then determine the rate you want to make it. The thing is, drenches, including drenching liners, is already on the label of all of these products. All these soil active products are labeled for drenches. So that's already there. Follow label directions, establish your volume based on the size of your container, just like you do for drenching pots. But you're going to have to look at that rate and volume when you're applying it to liners, because you're looking at early application and a longer term effect than if you're applying it to finished crops. So the labeling for the liner soaks is being pursued for Piccolo, C, and Concise, and a drench application for Ethifon is currently being pursued. I don't think we'll get the liner soak on this first amendment, but we'll certainly get the drench application submitted. So in summary, liner soaks and drenches can be very effective PGR application methods, but you are going to have to test them under your own conditions, just like you do every other PGR recommendation. Your species and cultivars are going to vary, so conduct your own trials. Basically, you have to kind of come up with a consistent method of application, then fine-tune the rate you need to use. Okay, that was a lot of information. I'd be happy to take any questions.